Hey, folks, welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thank you so much for joining us. Later on, we'll have the latest on where things stand in the Alberta teachers' strike. Also, more on the Canada-US relationship. A new survey for the Montreal Economic Institute finds that a solid majority of Canadians want the federal government to prioritize getting a new deal with the Americans. Maybe easier said than done. Now, certainly the issue of pipelines does relate to where things stand between Canada and the U.S. and where the Keystone XL could potentially be back on the table. Now, Thursday marks 1 month until the Grey Cup. And it sounds like this year it's going to be about more than just football, as the Prime Minister has announced the Grey Cup will be the setting of the backdrop for round 2 of the Major Projects Office and the projects that will be fast-tracked under this new process. The Alberta government would sure like a pipeline to be in the mix. And to that end, the Alberta government has announced recently, of course, that it is going to spearhead or lead the charge on a new pipeline application. Now, we're told that May is the target date to have a full application in place for the federal government to review, but the Premier has identified this Grey Cup announcement as the opportunity for the federal government to at least announce that this is something that will be fast-tracked under the Major Projects Office, or that it's something that the Prime Minister is prepared to identify as being in the national interest. Of course, there are still many questions about this pipeline project. Who's going to spearhead this project once it's no longer in the hands of the Alberta government? What is the route of this pipeline? What about the tanker ban? What about, of course, the importance of the consultation that needs to happen before this kind of a project can go ahead? One of the reasons why Northern Gateway, which it sounds like maybe this project could mirror somewhat, ran into such trouble in the courts before it was eventually denied by the Trudeau government. So like I say, still many questions about this pipeline project. And now with Keystone XL potentially back on the table, does it become an either or situation? Are we going south or are we going west? What's easier politically? What has more economic value? Does it even make sense to try to do both? In an atmosphere where there is some concern about softer oil prices, not to mention some of the political uncertainty, many questions about what makes the most sense here, and everything else that goes along with it. So joining us for some further perspective on these big questions, very pleased to welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show, Andrew Leach. He's an energy and environmental economist at the University of Alberta. He is a professor both in the Department of Economics and in the Faculty of Law. Professor Leach, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back.
Let me get your thoughts, first of all, on what the Alberta Premier has put forward, this pipeline plan. Obviously, a lot of questions still. I mean, we've seen in the past government involvement in getting Trans Mountain completed. We saw the Carney government get involved with the Keystone XL pipeline. But what's different or unique about the way Alberta's positioned this latest idea?
I get this is probably a little closer to Keystone XL and the government, or maybe Energy East, and the government's talking about taking a material interest in the project. We don't know a lot. They're saying they're going to be a proponent. They're putting some dollars on the table for application preparation, not big dollars yet. So some questions, but it feels like more active involvement from the Alberta government, both barrel-wise and maybe design. But I don't think we've heard, take ownership of or anything yet.
Mm-hmm. And I think the Alberta government sees an opportunity with the Major Projects Office and the legislation that has led to that creation. But I don't know if it's quite the magic shortcut maybe that it's being billed as. What has actually changed in terms of the regulatory landscape here?
Well, the regulatory landscape has changed so that now you have, from a practical perspective, the political decisions that would be made at the end of the project are now going to be front loaded at the beginning of the project. Of course, that doesn't bind future governments necessarily. There's always a possibility that a future government would change their views on that. But it does potentially take some of the uncertainty out of the process. I think, though, the other thing that it does, as you said, it introduces more shortcuts. And that's where our previous pipelines have gotten in trouble. They're sort of painted as these things that just stayed in the regulatory process forever. And it was this burdensome, overwhelming legislative process. But actually, if you look at where the time losses, so to speak, were on a project like Trans Mountain or on Gateway even, it was the shortcuts or the shortcomings of the regulatory process that meant that the Crown was not able to uphold its duty to consult, which meant the approvals got quashed by the courts. And so I think there's a much higher likelihood now, if you start following shortcuts right at the front end, that you're going to have that same kind of outcome.
Yeah, it's important, I guess, to look back at where Northern Gateway kind of went sideways, because I think more or less this is sort of being billed as Northern Gateway 2.0. And yes, I mean, Justin Trudeau did ultimately say no to that pipeline, but a lot happened and a lot went sideways before it got to that point.
Yeah, I mean, Gateway, I don't know when you say it died necessarily, but it was certainly all but dead, even in a Monty Python sketch sense, before Prime Minister Trudeau said it wasn't going to get its permit. And, it's often instructive to look back and say, how did the Harper government deal with that in 2014, for example? If you said today, like, and I do this with my students sometimes, imagine what it must have looked like the day that the Harper government approved Northern Gateway, right? It's a big press conference. It's all of the ministers are there. Jason Kenney is, beside himself with glee as, the senior minister for Alberta. That's how you'd imagine it. But none of that happened. Right? They 4:30 in the afternoon press released it. No media availability, no interest and engagement from the responsible ministers or the PM on that approval. And then the first minister to speak to it publicly was Jason Kenney. And he used the words, "no particular project is a national priority" when asked about the approval. Which, when you put that into the way things have gone since then, and the sort of push for pipelines, and be it from then Minister Kenney as Premier of Alberta or from the Conservatives in general, you wouldn't have that impression. James Moore, Senior Minister from BC, was very opposed, not necessarily to the idea of a project, but in particular to Enbridge executing that project, and had a lot of things to say in the House about Enbridge's capability to deliver that. So there was just a bunch of stuff going on in that project long before it got the courts, long before it ended up in Prime Minister Trudeau's hands.
Which should mean, I guess, that we've learned lessons from that. I mean, is that maybe the silver lining here potentially?
Potentially. I mean, I think we did learn some lessons from both Gateway and Trans Mountain on the Indigenous duty to consult, for sure. Now that landscape has also changed a little bit with the adoption of UNDRIP in federal legislation. So we've added some complications, or some complexity, is probably a better word there, while also having learned some lessons. On the political side, I think you're seeing a replay almost, right? You have a BC government that's saying, look, this is a project that is largely for the benefit of Albertans, with big risks on BC. And, may not be too long before we're back to Premier Clark's 5 conditions for BC's support for a pipeline. So it feels like, yeah, we've learned some lessons, but I don't know that the fundamental sort of underlying challenges of building a pipeline to northern BC have changed that much.
There was that other legal precedent, I guess, when BC, tried to legislate or regulate a pipeline, and in that case, it was TMX. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it does seem like we better understand the jurisdictional lines here. I guess there's still the political headache if a province is going to cause trouble, but do we at least have clarity on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that was particularly unclear to begin with, of course. But what's interesting now is we have a province, Alberta, saying, well, the federal government shouldn't be able to affect things in provincial jurisdiction, even if there's a federal impact, like fisheries or what have you. It's like, let us figure out oil sands projects, what have you. But then they're making the opposite argument on BC. We know that pipelines have impacts in BC. We know that they have effects in BC, or they potentially could, and they create risks, et cetera. But yes, the jurisdiction is arguably more clear. I mean, I think it was pretty clear to begin with. But what's still the case is, this is a new project. This is a new process. It opens up new avenues for legal challenges, for interference, et cetera. And that was really the issue before. I don't think anybody really thought that fundamentally BC could regulate the pipeline, or really say no to it from a legislative perspective, but they could sure make it really, really difficult. And I think they're going to do so again.
And so there is heavy lifting to do. I mean, I don't know if that's the Alberta government's responsibility at this point, maybe the private sector at some point. I get the sense that maybe Alberta would like Ottawa to do a lot of this heavy lifting. Are we kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit here?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of heavy lifting everywhere to do. I think on on shippers as well. So that was maybe the group that you didn't mention, the companies that would like to see that pipeline built. I think we don't have a clear where are those 800,000 barrels or 600,000 barrels, or if you ask the premier, 1 million barrels a day, where is that coming from? Right? We have a whole series of projects that are sitting in the approval queue. We don't have anyone really clearly saying, yes, I'm going to green light this project. We have a lot of people on the sidelines saying, if there had been a pipeline, we'd have Tex Frontier mine, we'd have all of these other things. But that seems like pure fantasy for at least the mining projects. The other ones, I think you need some of the shippers to come in behind. And the other thing that you have that's really interesting this time around. So if you remember last time, Keystone XL, Gateway, et cetera, the industry can sort of credibly say it's a question of pipelines versus rail, right? It's the oil price, the market is strong enough that most of this oil is going to get produced, and if need be, most shippers are going to be willing to ship it by rail or some other means. There might be some impacts, but now when you've got like 60s and $50 a barrel crude on the horizon, the pipeline becomes much more existential for any of that new production, which also means that, the induced employment is there, but the induced greenhouse gas emissions, the environmental effects, it sort of makes the pipeline, in a way, the project that people were trying to turn it into the last time around, right? People were trying to make it a referendum on oil sands and a referendum on greenhouse gas emissions, all within a regulatory process. But now you kind of have that. You have our 2030 targets are much closer. All of this is even our 2050 targets are closer. So the pipeline becomes almost a much larger question for the Carney government, for the Smith government, for the oil industry, et cetera, in a way that maybe it wasn't before.
Well, it does seem like there's an expectation for some kind of trade-off between Alberta and Ottawa here. I mean, the Pathways carbon capture project is held up as, maybe one key bargaining chip in all of this, but just more general on climate policy. Does Alberta need to demonstrate a further commitment to climate policy? Where is this going to factor in here?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of where I go back to the shippers, where we talk about pathways, right? Pathways is the pipeline, the gathering system, et cetera, for carbon capture, maybe some of the storage. But the big upfront capital investment is Cenovus going to build these facilities on their sites? Is Suncor, is CNRL, is ExxonMobil / Imperial? That's your big question. And right now, we're talking a lot with Pathways. Pathways doesn't have an oil sands project. Right? Pathways they're not going to be the ones that have to go to their shareholders and say, we'd like to spend $1 billion on a carbon capture and storage project with this federal support and this kind of side agreement. And, that's where the rubber is going to really hit the road on carbon capture. And, we're having this long drawn out conversation about the pipeline for carbon capture when that's, again, it's a fraction. Rounding error, and it's arguably the easiest to do because everyone can coordinate, pay a little bit. They don't have to go to their shareholders for that one big, multi-billion-dollar project that could, as when you talk about carbon policy, it could turn into a nothing, right? It could actually be something that is worth zero to your shareholders, and they will all rightly look down the line and say, the next federal election might bring in a Poilievre government. And Mr. Poilievre has said, no emissions cap, no grand bargain, no carbon price, no clean fuel reg, no clean electricity reg. So essentially you have a coin toss that $1 billion carbon capture and storage plant might be worth nothing to you. And those are the decisions that we're nowhere near making right now. Among the shippers or the would-be shippers on that pipeline. So you got to get that conversation going more quickly.
It's interesting too, in the midst of all of this, now all of a sudden we're talking about Keystone again, is, maybe part of trying to reach a trade agreement with the United States. I don't know if that seems like maybe more low-hanging fruit politically to have Keystone XL, maybe also, further expansion of Trans Mountain. I don't know where the value proposition is, though, West Coast versus Gulf Coast, all of those things come into play. But how much does this kind of change the dynamic potentially?
I mean, it changed it in a couple of ways. So obviously you bring Trump into the equation. It's just much more volatility and uncertainty. Keystone XL, we have the advantage that it's partly built on the Canadian side of the border, thanks to Premier Kenney's government. You have a market on the Gulf Coast that can take some of our crude. But one thing that was really interesting recently, Rory Johnston at his Commodity Context newsletter had some really nice evidence that that we were actually already re-exporting off the Gulf Coast a substantial quantity of Canadian crude oil. So like 400,000 barrels a day, which tells you that essentially that Gulf Coast market is saturated or close to saturated for Canadian crude. So then you just have to look at a map and say, if I'm going to export crude on a tanker, do I want to ship it to another jurisdiction, thousands of kilometers, or do I want to ship it, hundreds to a little over 1,000 kilometers to the West Coast? The math gets really easy on that. Yeah. You want to stay in your own country and you want to go west. And so I think Keystone XL, it actually risks doing the same thing it kind of did to Energy East, right? Energy East had 1 million barrels per day under long-term contract. Keystone XL appears back on the scene, and all of a sudden it has TC Energy with 2 pipelines that they're trying to fill. They can't fill Keystone XL because everybody's locked up on Energy East. None of those shippers want Energy East if they have the opportunity to move on Keystone XL. And you end up with a choice of, we can have one or the other. We end up with Keystone XL, and then it gets canceled. And you could very easily see that happening in some similar fashion, that the mythical pipeline that Premier Smith is talking about to Northwest BC, now all of a sudden, ExxonMobil's Imperial is probably more interested in Keystone XL than they would be in going west. Other shippers, not sure, but you kind of start dividing up your market, your shippers, et cetera, between those 2 projects, and neither of them have the momentum to go ahead.
From Ottawa's perspective, though, Keystone XL has the advantage. You don't have to worry about the tanker ban. You don't have to worry about BC. You don't really, at this point, have to worry too much about Indigenous consultation. Like it seems like a lot easier politically at this point.
Yeah, it's easier, but maybe I'm stepping on a Trudeau governmentism here. Hard things are hard, but sometimes they're worth doing. And the situation in the U.S., I think, should be giving everybody pause and alarm. And we really do not know what that market looks like in 3 or 4 years from now. And so I think you have to start. You have to do a lot more thinking about our infrastructure in ways we wouldn't have. Peter Terzakian had a piece about why we might want to build an Eastern pipeline just on the energy security basis. Just looking at the way Doug Ford, Premier Ford, said, "Oh, we can cut off electricity to parts of the U.S." Well, they can cut off oil to Ontario and some of Quebec pretty quickly. And it's in the permit that they can revoke that and require the removal of that infrastructure on the president's say-so. So we do have a very different world going there. And I don't know that it's, but for the Trump presidency, it's a really good market for us. It always has been. But now that world has changed a little bit, or a lot.
Yeah, it has. Speaking of the tanker ban, I think, the point was always kind of made that if you have a meaningful environmental review, it's almost kind of redundant to have a tanker ban, but it's got some political symbolism too. Is it something that the Carney government is going to have to revisit if this project is going to move ahead? Or it gets back to that question, does this major projects office and this whole process, does it create a bit of a workaround there?
To me, it's not even if the project is going to go ahead. If the project is going to get off the drawing board, they would have to signal that, at least for the purposes of this project, the tanker ban wouldn't apply, because you're not going to spend, even if you think of the dollars that Premier Smith, the 15 million or what have you, that she put on the table, designing a pipeline to a jurisdiction with a tanker ban, there's no point. And so, we wouldn't be sending crude for the use of Kitimat and Prince Rupert. And so it has to come early, and that indication has to be there and pretty clear early on. And that, of course, is going to trigger in and of itself now. That's another federal government decision that has implications on Indigenous rights absent the pipeline. Just to say we're going to lift that tanker ban, now that you have it in place, it's another change to a federal government decision that would trigger almost certainly a duty to consult. So it opens up some cans of worms, but I don't think you get any movement on a pipeline. there, unless people are, again, that there's that possibility of a conservative government. And if people are going to say, well, probably will be, we're not averse to betting on electoral outcomes, as we saw with Keystone XL, for example.
Yeah.
But if people are willing to make that bet and say we're going to start advancing this project on the premise that there will be a government in the future that would scrap that, I don't think the pipeline company is going to have that kind of appetite. Maybe the Alberta government will, but otherwise, I don't think you get very far unless it's materially changed.
And we've sort of been told that May is the target for having an application for the federal government, but there's also this expectation that we kind of get something, I guess, in about a month from now when the Grey Cup is. What could the federal government conceivably do or approve or announce so early in this process?
I don't think very much, and I think they would get themselves into deep trouble. Certainly, from an Indigenous community's perspective, if they were to say this is now deemed a project in the national interest, the legislation itself, Bill C5, says that before that happens, you have to be able to consult on a project. Who are you consulting with? Right? We don't know where this pipeline is going. Depending on which day you hear people talk about it, it's either going to Kitimat or to Prince Rupert. How do you consult on a pipeline that goes to one place or the other? If it's going to Prince Rupert, which is often the Premier's favorite port, and sort of a northern gateway, but we're going to reroute it at the end to Prince Rupert. Well, Northern Gateway decided they could not safely go to Prince Rupert. It's in their application. And so if you're thinking, you're asking implicitly, what you'd be asking the government to do would be to approve in principle a project that one of the major proponents said they could not safely build. And then you're going to go out and consult on that basis. It seems to me like a non-winning proposition. I think you have to have at least a couple things in place. You have to have clear shipper support. Can you get that by Grey Cup weekend? No, right? You're not going to have a material open season on a hypothetical pipeline by then. You need a route, right? You need to know where it is so that you know who the at least affected Indigenous communities are, or you're off on a very wrong foot very early on. And so I think the ball's actually in the court of the Premier and that consortium of pipeline companies to say, hey, we're going to try to follow the Coastal GasLink route. We're going to try to follow the previous Northern Gateway route. We're going to try to follow, something else in drawing lines on a map, nothing specific, but at least you got to know where it's ending up. And then the Carney government can maybe move far enough on consultation and on engagement with, there's another piece in the legislation that says the energy regulator has to sign off that you could build this pipeline safely before it's being designated as a project of a project of national interest. And you can't get there with a hypothetical pipeline to somewhere on the West Coast.
Yeah. We'll see what the coming weeks bring us. We'll leave it there for now. Andrew Leach, appreciate the insight. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
Our thanks once again to Andrew Leach, energy and environmental economist at the University of Alberta. And I guess we'll see now, just under a month away from the Grey Cup, what gets announced by the Prime Minister in terms of the next phase of major projects and where things stand on the pipeline front. And maybe he does have a decision to make. If we're going to use Keystone XL as a bargaining chip and trying to get an agreement with the United States, what does that mean for the proposed pipeline to the West Coast that Alberta's Premier is pushing? So a big decision potentially to be made there. We will talk a little bit more about Keystone XL, the Canada-U.S. relationship, coming up in a moment. Just first, the latest on where things stand with regard to the teachers' strike in Alberta. Now, as we record this, teachers remain on strike. Earlier this week on Tuesday, there was some bargaining that did restart between the province and the teachers, but it doesn't sound like at this point like that's really getting anywhere. Now, on Thursday, as the Premier was speaking to a business audience in downtown Edmonton, there was a teachers' rally just outside with, by some accounts, over 20,000 attending that rally, trying to make their voices heard to the province and to the Premier in particular. It does sound like the two sides are still far apart on certain issues, in particular when it comes to class sizes. Now, here's the other thing. The Alberta Legislature is set to resume just over a week from now. So by the end of this month, it's entirely realistic. And even some comments from the finance minister suggest that this is indeed on the table, back to work legislation. So, something else for the teachers to consider here. If the province is going to legislate them back to work, would that mean imposing a contract? Might that potentially mean binding arbitration? Are you better off to take your chances going that route, or does it put a little bit more pressure to at least try to get something now at the bargaining table? So on Wednesday, we did hear from both sides in this dispute. Alberta's premier was actually making a separate announcement about license plates of all things, but of course, once things got to the Q&A right away, everyone had some questions about the teachers' strike, and in particular on the issue of class sizes. We got an interesting answer from the premier about that. Here's what she said.
I want to ask you about the teachers' negotiations. I guess the question I have is, almost every other Canadian province has class size caps or a pupil-teacher ratio in law in their teacher's contract. And many striking teachers say that some kind of mechanism to permanently amend class size and complexity will make or break their acceptance of a contract. So why are you dismissing it?
Well, I guess I'm wondering how we would be able to enforce it. Because if we look at the number of teachers who are in class right now, I'll give you the numbers here and we'll make them available to you. There's 35,162 teachers. So that doesn't include substitutes, the 7,800 substitutes. And then there's admin and there's some vice principals and there's a whole other categories. So 35,162. And if we have 740,000 teachers, then that's 21 to 1. So we should already be able to have class sizes of 21. And so we have to kind of look into, why don't we? What is actually going on there? Is there some problem in administration in being able to allocate the teachers appropriately? Are there a lot of people working part-time? Shouldn't be the case, because I would think you'd be a substitute if you were working part-time. It isn't administration from what we can see. And so what we did see in the NDP time is they spent $2 billion on trying to get class sizes down, and were never successful at it. And I think it's because we have to have a common understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve, and we also have to understand why it is that the resources that we have are not being allocated in the way we would expect. So that's what we need to look into. The other thing I would say is what we're hearing from teachers is the issue of complexity. And so one of the things we're talking about is maybe what we need to do is, if we've got a very high needs student, maybe they need to have a full-time education assistant assigned to them. Maybe if we have complex needs in a classroom, say 4 kids in a classroom who are mild and moderate or have English as a second language, maybe we need to have an education assistant attached to that. Maybe we need to have a cap on how much complexity there is. Maybe that's the issue, is that we have to add more education assistants until you get to a point where you say, you know what, this is just too many complex needs kids for one teacher. So those are the things that I think we need to maintain the flexibility to do, because that's, I do believe that's going to get us to the solution that the teachers that we hear from are actually looking for.
And when you say a cap on complexity, what do you mean by that?
I don't know. I mean, that's something that I hope that we can talk to the teachers about, because that's just a concept that my education minister has put forward, is, do we have to be a lot more hands-on in monitoring the complexity in a classroom? And there's kids who have English language learning, there's kids who are on the spectrum, there's kids who have behavioral issues, there are kids who are in wheelchairs. So complexity has a whole diversity of manifestations. And so that's what I think, that's what we're hearing from teachers, is that if every kid was in a particular range of ability, then they might be able to accommodate larger class sizes. But with inclusion and more complexity, they need more hands on deck, either smaller class sizes or more education assistants. And we just think we need to maintain that flexibility to be able to assign. That's why we don't want the hard caps. And as I said, we're looking at the numbers saying it doesn't really make sense, because if you just look at the number of full-time teachers versus number of students, we should already be at 21 to 1.
Now, also on Wednesday, Jason Schilling, president of the Alberta Teachers Association, was holding his own press conference to update folks on where things stand from their perspective, and again, to try to lay out what it is teachers want to see addressed. And in particular, Jason Schilling was asked about a comment from the province about the importance for the teachers' demands to be, quote, rooted in reality. And when he was asked about that, well, he kind of took exception to that comment.
It is rooted in reality. You want reality? Go look at our classrooms across this province. You want reality? Look at the overcrowded classrooms we have. Look at the students who don't have their needs met. Look at teachers who are teaching classrooms in boot rooms, in hallways, on stages of gyms. Look at the reality that is in our classrooms that is due to the chronic underfunding that we've seen in this system. To say that we're not rooted in reality, we are working in schools on the front lines every single day, dealing with the ramifications of the failure of this government to do right by the students of this province, their parents, and the rest of Alberta. That's the reality of what's going on right now. And I think that government may be disconnected from what is happening in our schools and what their perceived notions are of what education in Alberta really is.
Okay, so that was all on Wednesday. The comments there from Alberta Teachers Association President Jason Schilling and comments from the Premier, the big rally in downtown Edmonton, that was on Thursday. As of now, no movement, it seems, toward a potential deal and ending this strike. So we'll see what happens over the next week to 10 days as we get closer to the legislature resuming and that looming possibility of the province legislating teachers back to work. So that's where things stand on that front. As mentioned, did want to touch on the Canada-U.S. relationship in this episode of the podcast. Of course, the Prime Minister was back in Washington, D.C. just recently, but came home empty-handed in terms of getting some kind of a new agreement in place with the United States. But work does continue behind the scenes to that end. What does a new deal with the United States look like? Are we going to be able to preserve the Canada-U.S. trading relationship as we've come to know it? And more to the point, I guess, is that what Canadians want? It feels like we're at a bit of a crossroads here with the United States in terms of moving forward. Do we want to move forward in the same way? Do we feel like maybe we've been betrayed or let down by the Americans? Is it time to look elsewhere? Well, a new poll out this week from the Montreal Economic Institute finds that Canadians still value this relationship, and Canadians want this federal government to make it a priority to get a deal. You can read more about this survey at iedm.org. But joining us for more on all of this, very pleased to welcome here to the program Renaud Brossard. He is VP of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute. Renaud, so great to have you with us here.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
It is interesting because, there's a sense maybe the Canadians have kind of grown frustrated or concerned with the direction of the United States, or maybe we're looking elsewhere for new trading relationships. But what does this new polling tell us about where Canadians are at on that question?
I think you're right that for a long time, Canadians were frustrated. There has been a sort of emotional response, I want to say, to the trade conflict with the U.S. Most Canadians feel that we did not deserve to be treated this way by the U.S. But I think as time drags on, people are understanding that having access to the U.S. market, to 340 million wealthy consumers, is not something that we can replace tomorrow morning, and that it is paramount that we keep this relationship to prosper as a nation. So when we ask Canadians about this, 66% of Canadians said that maintaining this relationship with the U.S. was either important or very important to ensuring Canada's prosperity. Now I'm seeing 66% said that this was important. It's not that a third of Canadians don't think it was important. Actually, there's only about 5% of respondents that say it was not important in their view. It's really there's a lot of people that think that the issue is a little bit complex, that maybe there's some information they don't have, so they don't want to take a position on it. But what we see is really that among Canadians that have an opinion on this, like the very vast majority of people want a renewed relationship with the U.S.
Right. And it's easy enough to see the connection because as we've seen a disruption in our trading relationship with the United States, we've seen the economic impact here. We've seen the economic slowdown, job losses. So the connection between jobs and prosperity and having a solid trading relationship with the United States, a lot of Canadians do see and make that connection.
They do, and just to put some numbers into perspective here, when we're talking about Canada-U.S. trade, just in terms of exports last year, we're talking about roughly $600 billion worth of merchandise. That is a lot of money. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of companies that depend on that, and Canadians understand that. So when we ask them, roughly in the same proportion, so about 2/3 of Canadians say that if this trade deal, if Mark Carney is unable to reach a trade deal, or if we're unable to keep our relationship with the U.S., Canadians are fearful of the effect it would have on employment, but also on our prosperity. And when I say prosperity, it's not just the amount of money you've got in your bank account, but also, and I think most importantly, our standard of living and our ability to keep living the way we do with the homes that we have, with the cars that we have, with the grocery budgets that we have. So people are indeed concerned about this.
So, in terms of where it ranks as a priority, Canadians wanting to see some kind of a trade deal with the U.S., that remains top of mind, doesn't it?
It does. Canadians say that about 60%, so 6 in 10 Canadians say that getting a new trade deal with U.S. is either the very top priority or very close to a top priority. So some that say that is a critical priority for the Carney government. That's about 60%. There's another 27% that says it's a moderate priority, but again, very, very few people that do not see this as some sort of priority. And it's understandable given the concerns over jobs and over our entire economy and our country's prosperity, essentially.
So, what does it tell us about how Canada should be approaching this challenge? Because, look, it's not easy. Clearly, the Trump administration has taken a different approach when it comes to international trade and trading relationships. But what does that tell us then about, for example, the idea of counter tariffs or moving away from the United States in light of what Canadians have identified here?
I think what it tells us is that Canadians are sending this government a very clear message, both Carney and, of course, the opposition parties, that they understand that getting this trade deal is of paramount importance. So we need to make sure in this negotiation that Canada's interests are protected. Of course, we can't accept just any deal, but Canadians are willing to give a little bit of leeway to the federal government to negotiate what is going to be the best available deal for Canada. And one of the things that we keep hearing about, at least from the U.S. side nowadays, is that they're not just looking at a trade deal. They might be looking at something a little bit bigger. So I think that's a broader agreement that encompasses other areas. There's things such as defense. There's things such as resources, and of course, we need to look at every single one of them individually and make sure that it fits what is Canada's national interest. But there's a chance that maybe what we're going to have with this new administration, I think Canadians, with the importance that they give in renewing this trade deal, are sort of giving the Carney government a license to negotiate that, would be to have a sort of broader deal that does not just encompass trade, but it gives us a little bit of other guarantees. There's areas such as defense, for instance, that have been quite important for us in the past. We've always had practically always had a strong defense relationship with the U.S. So maybe codifying it again as part of this deal might be another area where it would be interesting. But of course, there's other areas where we could ensure the U.S. has some access to strategic resources that it needs. The Trump administration has been pushing very, very hard for energy security. Well, one thing, and I don't think your audience is going to learn anything new from me when I say this, but one thing Canada does have is a lot of energy. We have a lot of oil. We have a lot of gas. We have the infrastructure to export it. But we also have uranium. We also have hydroelectricity. And because of our reliability as a trading partner, there's a way that we could have a sort of resource, a sort of agreement to give secure access to the Americans to these resources at fair value, understandably, but to have a sort of more secure trading relationship that could be beneficial to both of our countries.
It's interesting too, because Canada has its own protectionist kind of impulses. We've seen even with other trading partners, right? Our unwillingness to bend on supply management has been a trade obstacle. Canada has imposed its own tariffs, although we have scaled some of those back in this recent dispute with the United States. So how does Canada then, if we really want to get an agreement, how do we need to approach our own protectionist policies?
Well, being at the MEI, we're a free market think tank. We strongly believe that a lot of those protectionist policies would have to go, but then it's a matter of give and take. And it's not because those protectionist policies are good for us. They're not. I think we need to be clear. Things such as supply management, it enriches a couple of farmers, but it does make those products much more expensive for everyday Canadians. So protectionism is one of those things that would have to go, where we can use every single thing that every single one of those barriers that we look to lower as a way to lower some other trade barriers from the U.S. So, for instance, if we're talking about supply management, maybe giving a little bit of extra access to the U.S. to our dairy market wouldn't be such a bad thing if what it means is getting tariff-free access for our steel mills and our aluminum smelters, or if it means making sure that our oil, our energy, is not getting tariffed at 10%. There's a lot of different things that we can that we have at our advantage that can be used in these negotiations. And let's be clear, the U.S. is a much larger economy than we are. That's for sure. But it's not like the U.S. is also completely invulnerable to any of the different tools that we can use to negotiate with them. They're not self-sufficient in a number of things, and we're one of the most reliable suppliers that they have for these things. Whether it is aluminum and steel, for instance, well, we're right there. There's no security issue. There's no we're an ally. We're aligned on a lot of issues. So there's a lot of that certainty and that security that we can give them if we're able to potentially negotiate one of their that greater agreement that we're talking about.
We'll see if that comes our way in the weeks and months ahead here. Much more on these poll results and more on these issues, iedm.org. Renaud, thanks again for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, once again, that was Renaud Brossard. He is VP of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute. Also, our thanks to Andrew Leach at the University of Alberta. We'll continue, of course, to monitor the teacher situation. Be sure to check out the latest episode of the Line Alberta podcast, where we delve into some of the issues around the teacher strike, in particular now this debate around funding of private schools and the potential of a referendum whether Alberta's policy toward having public dollars follow students in the private system, whether that needs to be revisited. So more on that at alberta.readtheline.ca. Much more as well at robbreakenridge.ca. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. Have a great weekend, folks, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.